First of all, I'd like to welcome all of our participants that are here this evening with us for our virtual town hall. We see that we have 200 participants, over 200 participants and counting. And I'd like to first start off by thanking Mike Weber with Foxborough Cable Access for setting this up for us and hosting this evening. I'd also like to recognize all of our panelists that are here on this virtual town hall this evening. Myself, Amy Bertos, the superintendent, Dr. Mello, the assistant superintendent, Mr. Bill Yukna, who is the business manager, Mike Stanton, who is the principal at the Taylor Elementary School, Kate Campbell, who is the principal at the Igo Elementary School, Michelle McCarthy, the principal of the Borough Elementary School. We have Corey Michaelazik, who is our new director of student services, on the call. We also have Aaron Heyer, who's our director of technology, and Richard Pearson, who's the chair of the school committee as well. So I'd like to thank all of them for being here on the panel with us this evening. This evening is going to be sharing information with you of the planning that we've been doing to date. As you can imagine, it is not a normal summer for any of us. And there has been a great planning process that continues throughout the summer and guided obviously by vigilant monitoring of public health in Massachusetts. And we are encouraged by the numbers that we see and the indicators in the virus, particularly here in Foxborough. It's going the right direction. But we also know that what's on the minds of many are what are the plans for the fall. So we wanted to share some of the information with you. We have a Q&A feature where Dr. Mello will be monitoring the questions that are coming in. I know that we will not be able to answer all of the questions this evening, and it will be some because we don't have the answers. And some because even maybe next week when we talk about in a little bit how we'll be presenting our plans to school committee, we may not even have the answers at that time. But that is because we're waiting on things that determines by science and at the same time with some other information that's waiting to come out. So this evening, we're going to go over a number of sections that include our feasibility study that we've been engaging in. That's going to talk about transportation, our facilities and operations, spacing, cohorting of students, some survey data that we've received from all of you as parents, and thank you for engaging in those surveys, to talk about the subcommittee work that's been taking place, how we're addressing health and safety considerations, technology, special education, talk about the 3 models for plans. So as you've heard, the Massachusetts Department of Education has asked districts to submit a preliminary plan that addresses the feasibility of what the plans would look like for the return to school. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the questions that you have, they may be answered as we go along the way. So we'll stop after the different sections, and depending on the questions that are there, might have some of the other panelists answer those questions. But those options that we have to plan for the return to school include a full in-person plan, a hybrid plan where it's a combination of students that are in person and then learning remotely at home, and then a plan that would be for 100% remote for all of our students that would be learning from home. The plan itself has to be approved by the school committee, and it's due to the Department of Education by August the 10th. So given significant changes in plans in the way schools operate, we obviously are having to make a lot of different changes in what we are accustomed to for the school year. We're on a very tight timeline. It's a mere 2 weeks really until the August 10th deadline that's set by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. We're submitting our final plans. So with that, the sections that I wanted to talk about, the first being the feasibility study. And so what does this mean? This means that we had to look at all of our building spaces and our students that would be coming back to us and meeting the requirements of what are set out by the Department of Education, the Board of Health, and all of the other guidelines that we've received from the Department of Education. So again, the purpose is to share with you this planning, and it's not going to get in all of the detail of the planning. That will be next Wednesday at our school committee meeting on August the 5th at 7 p.m. So this conversation, if you will include some of the surveys that we will detail more specifically at that meeting. But at that time, we also will share what those plans that we're proposing will look like. So a decision has not been made at this point and will not be made. So this opportunity allows us to collect more feedback from you to inform our planning, just as our many subcommittees that have been working so far this summer. They've been meeting weekly. They've been taking the feedback that we've received from the 3 surveys that have gone out to you, the one that took place in June from the remote learning survey, that we had a great participation rate. We shared that information at a school committee meeting in June. We then had the survey that went out to you as far as transportation, and then the intent to return to school for your students, and what your thoughts are at this point in time. So taking that information, that first round of feedback through surveys and the work from the subcommittees, that has really been helping us to develop our plans. So our subcommittees themselves, as I said, they've been meeting weekly. They include school facility and operations, auxiliary programs, that includes extended day, our athletics, our music program, transportation, health, wellness, and safety, our academics, teaching and learning, which is represented by regular education teachers, general education teachers, special population areas, such as when we think about art and music, all of our department heads, our curriculum directors, our principals, our assistant principals, myself, the business manager, our facilities director, the Board of Health, Director of Emergency Services, Deputy Chief Tom Kenvin. So there are many, many people on these subcommittees that have been working so many hours already to put together a plan with having our children be able to come back to schools safely, with the goal for them to be in person. Now, with that said, we also have to take into account what we were able to learn from our feasibility study. That included actually physically going out to classrooms, measuring every single space to see if we would be able to have students back in person fully. And at that being said, it was 6 feet of distance between individuals where feasible is the goal, but at the same time, a minimum physical distance of 3 feet's been established when other combined measures that have been outlined for safety requirements, such as children and all staff wearing masks. It's actually grades 2 and above for students and strongly encouraged for kindergarten and first grade students, hand washing, hand sanitizing, limiting movement of students by cohorting children to where it might be students not traveling from one classroom to another, and having teachers move, limiting distancing throughout the building and movement. So that combined with all of the safety requirements, would we be able to have all children back in school in person with at least that minimum of 3 distance, which has been by the Department of Education, as well as all of the task force they've had, in addition to the American Pediatric Association, saying that with that combination, that a minimum of 3 feet, although 6 feet is the desired preference, that would still be safe, based on also the evidence and the lower risk of COVID transmission that takes place with younger students. So as we've worked through our feasibility study, we were able to identify that yes, in our spaces, if we move particular classrooms that may be smaller, that we could distance students at the 3 feet and have all students back in class. Where some of the challenges lie within that feasibility study or the regulations around cafeterias and transportation. So as an example, for students to eat in the cafeteria, they need to be 6 feet apart based on being able to take their mask off to eat. Our cafeteria tables are round, they're 5 feet tables. So in order to have all students in the cafeteria to be 6 feet apart to be able to take their mask off to eat, we're not able to accomplish that in the cafeterias. So then it's a matter of, well, can you have students eat in the classroom, or can you have split schedules where you're using the cafeteria and you're using the classroom at the same time? If you have your classrooms at 3 feet, you can imagine the challenges that come along with masks, taking those off, and then even supervising students if you're splitting classrooms for lunch. So it's an understatement to say that it's been very challenging. to be able to come up with any of the solutions for this. And the other is transportation. With the regulations, we can only have basically a third of our buses filled, which is 27 students. So as you may be aware, at the most recent, actually the last school committee meeting, we had talked about transportation. The state law is that we transport students from 2 miles and then kindergarten as well. But we currently in Foxborough transport all of our kindergarten students with 1 mile and from K to 12. We're not able to accomplish that with the distancing that is required on buses of 27 students if we were to keep at that 2 mile mark. So that means a policy change as far as with school committee in order for that to take place. We've also been looking at our HVAC systems, and that's something that Mr. Yukna, I can have him talk a little bit about here in a second, but we know that there's many different requirements that we have to meet when it comes to filters and cleaning those. And we have done that and we continue. That's something that we've actually focused on for the last number of years pretty heavily on. And then we need to have hand sanitizing stations in every single classroom and strategic places around buildings and distancing. So that, along with assigned seating at a full person return, that is something through that feasibility study that we've been able to identify that we could, that it would be at a 3 feet, possibly more 4.5 feet when you think seat to seat based on the requirements. But we're not able to have all students return back to the facilities based on the 6 feet. It would have to be 3 feet, as our facilities are just not equipped to have that many kids in a classroom that far apart. So that kind of information, along with our subcommittees, that's the kind of information we've looked at to say, okay, well, how does that inform our planning as we go forward? Because clearly our goal is the safe return of students. Their safety and our staff safety is our first priority. And it also needs to be grounded in the data, the science data that we see. So I'm going to stop for a moment and see, based on just the feasibility study and talking about facilities, if there are any specific questions, or in the moment, if Mr. Yukna had anything else that he wanted to add from the facilities standpoint.
Yes, I think it's important to understand that, as Dr. Boudreaux pointed out, we have for years now concentrated during the summer times to really make sure we do deep cleanings on our HVAC systems, and that we make sure that they're all working as efficiently as they should be. Each building, based on its age, obviously has different equipment involved. Some of the biggest guidance that's out there deals with air exchange within the classrooms. There's 2 ways that people look at that. One is what they call, the fresh air intake, and the other is the air exchange. Really, the most important part of those 2 is the fresh air intake. The requirement by state code is that you have to have at least a 20% fresh air intake. However, what they're looking for now is that the intake be much higher. And it would more than likely be somewhere between 30 and 100%, depending on the outside air temperatures as well. Our systems are capable of doing that. So we have the controls on how much fresh air comes into the buildings, and we monitor that, through our automated systems. And in many of the classrooms, especially on the elementary level, but really throughout the middle school and high school, also have univents, which are individual units within each classroom. And those univents also bring in fresh air directly into the classroom. So it's not going from a major system up on the roof having to be piped all the way in. It's going directly from the exterior wall into the classroom. And again, they have those same damper controls on how much fresh air you bring in at any point in time. So, very important. All those are cleaned, thoroughly cleaned during the summer. All new filtering systems are put in. There's been a lot of hot conversation about what MERV level of filter system you put in. To be honest with you, the biggest problem right now is getting the highest level. Not that any commercial building or school normally would use a MERV 18 level, and that's probably why there's just isn't enough of that out there. The other way to handle it is to use a lower MERV level, a 7 to a 10 or 11, but replace it more often, and take the impurities out of the air that way. But the most important part is that the air is actually moving and running through those systems, and that the systems are running properly. So all of our systems have been checked. They're continually being worked on right now, even just to make sure that they're as efficient as they possibly can be. And I think in a lot of ways, because of the age of the high school, the middle school, being newer and having obviously being the larger schools, they actually have better equipment overall, which is really important when you get into these 200,000 square foot buildings. So, but again, we're comfortable that the elementary level facilities are working the way they're supposed to and the way they were designed to work.
And then also too, as far as the feasibility study, when it comes to all of the cleaning protocols that we obviously are following all state and federal cleaning requirements. And in order to have our environment from a cleaning standpoint, some of the things that we would have to do is our custodian coverage, where we have custodians that are here in the evenings. We would have some of those custodians during the daytime for the additional cleaning that would take place. We have purchased the electrostatic machines for all of our buildings. We have 2 in each building, and then 2 additional backpack cleaners. Those are the fogging machines that come through and are able to disinfect and clean large areas very quickly, which when we talk about cohorting students, which is trying to limit students to a classroom and then to be able to clean after they've left each day, that we'll be able to do that quickly and efficiently, in addition to all of the other protocols that we would be following and have been with touching those spaces that are high touch points and meeting the bathroom requirements and extra cleaning and being really vigilant with all of those spaces. So there's many protocols and procedures that we have to follow. And as a result, in order to do that and to meet the needs of all of the buildings, one of the examples through that feasibility study is having to change some of the schedules for our custodians in order to meet all of the cleaning protocols.
I think in further for that, obviously we're not just talking the buildings, we're talking school buses, virtually any point that we have control of the student. And so all of those places have been equipped with different disinfecting machines and products. We actually just got notice that we were able to acquire 3 more of the backpack units. So all schools will have those. The nice thing about that is literally we can go through classrooms in minutes and disinfect on a regular basis now. And then we also have the handheld ones, which allow us to go into the bathrooms and quickly do a disinfect at any point in time. The buses are all equipped with sprayers for the same thing. And as Dr. Burrows pointed out originally, we have been buying since the spring large quantities of disinfectants, gloves, masks, all of the PPE stuff that has been out there. We got ahead of that game and used numerous suppliers to do that. So we feel fairly comfortable that we have the supplies we need to make sure the classrooms, the teachers, and the students have access to what is needed to, again, keep everybody safe.
Okay, we do have a few questions coming into the chat that are related to the feasibility study. So I'm just going to share those, and then either Mr. Yukna or Dr. Burdos, or if I can answer it, I'll answer. The first one is, who will be training the teachers and staff on PPE, especially the custodians? Will the schools be using the same type of disinfectant that we use in hospitals? If the child has a fever and is suspected to have COVID, is there a place to put them?
I'll answer the first part that I can. You'll see shortly on our website, we're going to have the protocols that have been developed for cleaning and disinfecting. It also has the different items that we are using, and many of them are, if not all of them, are based on cleaners that are allowed to be used in hospitals, nursing homes, and schools, and they meet all of the current standards and requirements. So that's one part. As far as the custodians and the cleaning techniques, they've actually are signed up for a full training within a week or two that they will all be going through, that will give them all of the guidance based on having the PPE for themselves as well. to keep themselves safe, but also to make sure that they're hitting, as Dr. Bertos noted, the high touch points. You'll note when we do put this up on the website, you'll see all the high touch points that are actually listed as to what are the expectations on a regular basis. And then obviously each night we'll be going through and doing a more thorough clean on all facilities, on every level. So as one of the things we do know, this will cost us more money no matter what our scenario is if we're in school, because we will be using more custodians. We do have a lot of part-time custodians. We'll be probably upping those in their hours to be more full-time to give us that added push as far as being able to do the daily cleaning.
Okay, I think you covered this, but if students eat in the classroom, is it the teacher's responsibility to clean up? Is this safe? The answer to that is no. The custodians will be using the electrostatic cleaners between sessions. I think you covered that, Mr. Yukna. How many exchanges per hour do the HVA systems do? I do not know the answer to that.
It's the exchanges themselves it's by building, because again, each building is different. And to be honest with you, what we've done is brought in an outside consultant to look at each unit to be able to give us a number on it, because you can't tell, there's no diagram, if you will, on each individual unit event that tells us that. So, but we do know we're meeting the standards based on, the buildings themselves. But, as far as what, is it 10 an hour? Is it, what? We don't have that broken down yet, which we do expect to have shortly.
Are the measurements with the furniture or only the room size? So I can speak to that a little bit. We've actually been up there with tape measures and actually spacing out the desks to see if there needs to be any extra furniture that's removed, but it is including the furniture that's in the room. I don't know if you want to add to that, Mr. Yukna.
Yeah, actually we've removed a lot of furniture in different classrooms to get down to the classrooms having the furniture that they need based on the 6 foot, to see what that really looks like. And so far, we're comfortable that works, but it's based on furniture. It's not just based on measurements. The measurements don't do anything for you, because you need to be able to make sure it lays out appropriately based on where the teacher is going to stand and teach from, and how each child would be set up in the room itself.
And I would just also add too, as part of all of that work, we've had to make moves from certain classrooms, from certain grade levels, to move to spaces that would be able to accommodate those measurements. At the same time, when we have tables in classrooms, we're having to replace those tables with desks in order to accommodate those space requirements as well. So there's been a lot of work as far as measurement and really taking out furniture and replacing it with furniture, looking at, when we talk about even the cafeteria, when I mentioned before, those 5 feet round tables, at that distance, you have one child sitting at a table. So taking the round tables out, replacing them with rectangle tables in order to have more students in a cafeteria, adding an additional lunch, for an example, at the high school level, and different spaces for lunches as well. So from a facility operation, there's been a lot of movement when it comes to thinking about the space itself and to be able to accommodate all of those requirements. If we could move to the next kind of section, if you will, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the parent feedback has been so important through our surveys. As I mentioned before, we've had 3 of the surveys that have gone out. More specific of that data that hasn't been shared for the second 2 surveys, the transportation and the return to school, will be shared at next week's school committee meeting. But I would just like to say that although parents haven't been on those subcommittees, that information that we've collected through the surveys and gathering the voices from all of that data has been so critical to our planning. So as an example, when we look across the 3 levels, we see that 60% of families said that they would send their students back if it were at the 6 foot versus the 3 foot. That's significant when we look at that data from elementary, middle school, and high school. And it was actually very interesting to see how consistent it was. The number of surveys that we had returned from our parents to provide that information. So just as an example, at the high school, we have 793 students for next year. We had 741 surveys. Now, granted, that can be a survey filled out twice for a student. So it's not a perfect science there, but I think it shows the involvement, commitment of our families to be able to provide that information. At the middle school, we have 775 students about for next year, and we had 736 responses. Again, for students to return at that minimum 3 feet, only 60% of families were comfortable with that, with an additional 27%, as an example, comfortable if it were at the 6 feet, which is the CDC guidelines. And then we had a number of students that are not able to return because of they are immunocompromised or someone in their family, or families that said they're just not comfortable with the 3 or 6 feet and would prefer remote learning. At the elementary level, the numbers were really extremely similar. With about 600 or so elementary students, we had over 800 surveys that were completed. And again, the exact same percentage of students that would return families' comfort level at the 3 feet was 60%, 24% at the 6 feet. I know that I'm giving these numbers and throwing those out, but they will be visually shown at the school committee meeting next week, so you can really get a better visual representation of those. But the point that I want to make is that that information is so important for our subcommittee work to be able to inform our planning. The same goes for transportation. When we sent out that survey, it was by those that ride the bus. 75% of our students said that yes, they would be taking the bus in the fall. So when we think about the third capacity for transportation, that information is really, really critical to that planning. So I'll pause there, Dr. Mello.
We actually have quite a few questions in the chat. Some of them are getting into our other topics that are going to be coming up a little bit later. But there is a couple that are related. Will children be in the vicinity of the fogger when that's happening? Could that be bad for them and students with breathing issues? And are the chemicals being used possibly toxic? So those are related to what we've been talking about.
No, we're always under strict guidelines with OSHA and other agencies that none of the products we use, they all have to be green. They can't be toxic. And even to that, there are levels, and we would be using 2 different levels. One that's a more mild level during the day if we're doing any fogging, and a more probably stringent one during the night for the overnight cleaning. But all of them are capable of being in front of anybody. However, we would never fog a room or an area with a student, adult, or anybody there. It's literally the room is empty. We fog it, and then within virtually minutes, you're okay to go back in the room. So it would always be empty rooms that are being fogged, not occupied.
There is someone asking to wait on the Q&A and just get through the other models. So if we want to do that so that we don't run out of time, I think Dr. Bertos did say at the top of the meeting that we will be downloading the Q&A from this meeting, and we will do our best to answer the questions that we can and use it to inform the presentation that we give at the school committee on Wednesday. I do have one more question though that I would like to put out right now that said, has it been considered to have classes or lunches outside during September and October?
I would say yes to that, in the sense that some of the spaces are more conducive than others. When we think about the high school, we have already an outdoor eating space that we could utilize, but even with that outdoor space, we have to think about the movement and supervision as well. So it's not just a matter of just having spaces for students to go to.
I would also add a little bit to that. We've talked about some of our programs that in nice weather easily can move outside in a class environment, potentially something like music, which could be outside very easily, and being able to distance even further apart when we do that. So yes, I think we've discussed that at length, and basically by each area within each building.
Okay, so I guess we will continue then, and we'll hold these questions for a little bit later.
I'll just mention a little bit here on technology, and then if there's a specific question afterwards, Mr. Heyer can answer those. But we've purchased laptops. Many of you may have heard that as far as the one-to-one environment that we're moving to. If we are full in person, those students in kindergarten through 4th grade, the laptops would stay in the classroom with the teacher. They would be using those, knowing that at any point, if we were to go in a hybrid mode or remote, that is something that it's not a matter of the familiarity, with students, and kind of working that muscle and working that into our curriculum so that they have that just normal use with having a one-to-one device in that area. Our middle school and high school students would take those devices home with them. Obviously, if we're in a hybrid mode from K to 12, those devices would go home. In addition to that, we're developing digital citizenship and responsibility training for students with those devices and for staff and parents. We would have content filtering for those devices that are going home. So that way, when you think about going online, being able to keep kids safe and not having them be able to just access anything, we would be purchasing that content filtering for those devices. And then professional development, just not even for just teachers and our students and how to use those, but for parents too. That's one of the things that really came out clear in our remote learning survey that was in June, that it would be helpful for parents to understand what programs students are using, how they're using them, and that at the same time, what is it that they may not be able to view? For instance, if they're in Microsoft Teams, the parent doesn't have the access to the team itself. When we think about collaborating and uploading the information, that's the student's portal. And not all understood that, and it's completely understandable why. So we would have different videos to help parents navigate the different resources that we're using. So in regards to technology, I'll pause there.
Why is Foxborough so far behind other surrounding towns in regards to technology?
I would actually, well, I'm not going to speak for Aaron, but I would actually say that Foxborough is not behind. We have developed a pretty robust internal system relative to our networks and our capability. We chose years ago to have that model be based on the in-school model versus a one-to-one model. So the difference between us and some of our neighboring communities, not all of them obviously, is that we had almost as many computers as we had students, but they were based on ones that would be in labs and classrooms. So the switch now is obviously to say that each one obviously will need something technology-wise to be home, an environment we never had to, depend on in the past. So I guess I'll leave it to Aaron from there. But I think from an overall technology point, we are far ahead of many communities with what we have is what supports our networks, which is the town has spent a lot of money to do over the years.
Again, I think we've spent a lot of time over the last 4 or 5 years making sure that our technology matches our instructional programs and letting our instructional programs drive decisions around hardware needs and software needs. I think in terms of pivoting to respond to remote learning, Foxborough's been pretty quick to respond in terms of identifying needs, going out and being able to procure laptops for students K to 12. Again, we're working on our professional development plans and emphasizing the use of digital learning strategies, whether we're here in the buildings, continuing to provide a lot of opportunities for students to engage in digital learning and the use of technology to potentially aid in a switch to remote learning or to a hybrid learning scenario if needed. Again, I think that if we had been talking about needing to go to a fully remote learning scenario within a couple of weeks, prior to March, nobody would believe us, right? So again, I think that we've had to pivot, and we've done that. But in terms of being behind in technology in other communities, I'm not quite sure exactly, what that question is speaking to.
Okay. Thank you. I think there really is a strong desire to get to the different remote learning or the different possible plans. So I do have a lot of questions in the chat. I will hold on to them. I will say just in brief that if there is any type of remote learning, because there are a lot of questions about that, it will look extremely difficult, extremely different than it did in the spring, because we were in an emergency remote learning situation, and this would be much more planned and proactive instead of reactive. So we will be getting to that. So I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Berdos and let her continue with the other topics.
So as Dr. Mello was just saying, we know how incredibly hard that our educators and families worked last spring to be able to implement the remote learning. And we also know that it presented enormous challenges. So it will be different. It will be different in the sense that students will be required to be in attendance and will be taking attendance. Grades will be given. It's not going to be optional work. It's going to be very structured. We can't replace the brick and mortar school. We also don't want students online 6.5 hours a day, but we weren't able to have the synchronous instruction back during the emergency learning time period, as Dr. Mello just said, due to not being one-to-one and thinking about the equity for students and having those devices. At the same time, they may have had the devices and were sharing those. So by purchasing those laptops, that will be a solution there. But at the same time, we know that the professional development for teachers and the training for students is going to be really important if we are in a remote learning environment. If we speak about the pros and cons of the different models, in person, a hybrid plan, or remote learning, an in-person plan based on the current guidance, the cons, if you will, it goes back to the transportation having to change. We know that the 3 feet distancing is the minimum. It's not the optimal. We also know that students would be wearing masks all day, every day, if we were in that plan. In the hybrid learning model, where we would have the combination of both, there are pros and cons there as well. And honestly, it is the absolute hardest plan to be able to develop because of the many layers that are involved. When we think about the discussions that maybe you've heard from other districts in a hybrid, there are some districts that have said 1 week out, 1 week in with students. We've had many conversations around this, and we don't feel that that is what's best for students, to have students completely out for a week and then in for a week. And at the same time, childcare for families, that makes it incredibly different. At the same time, we recognize that the circumstances of every family and staff member actually are very different, and there's no plan that will ultimately satisfy everyone in our community. But we're working really hard to be able to meet the needs of all students. And with that being said, when we think about, again, if you're a week out and you're week in, the transition time for students is really difficult. We think about something like February vacation or April vacation and students returning after a week out. That transition is really hard for students. The social emotional learning, our mental well-being of our students, to be out and not to see them for a full week, that is not what would be the best for students. And so again, that week out, weekend, it just really adds also for potential learning gaps. We know that in the fall, based on the circumstances for the last quarter of the school year, we're going to really need to look very closely at where our students are, assess the learning gaps that took place, have our interventions that are in place with thinking about our reading specialists, our math specialists, to be able to accelerate those learning gaps, identify them, work with our students to get them where they need to be. The other factor that came out loud and clear in the parent survey was motivation engagement, how difficult it was for parents to motivate their students and keep them engaged on that computer at times, and then just with the work itself. So in thinking about motivation engagement, thinking about transition, thinking about wanting to see our students more regularly and the social emotional aspect and the academics, that just made it more difficult. So then we transitioned and we started to think about, well, if we were to split the week to where you had, again, the reason for the hybrid is to reduce the population of the students in each building, to essentially reduce by half. That would allow for transportation to be able to have students. It would allow for greater opportunity to use the cafeteria with switching out tables to meet students' needs. But what would the model look like? So we then got into the discussion of our students. We're always making decisions that are in the best interest of students. And in order to meet their needs, the needs even in the classroom vary widely. The needs of students at the elementary level versus the needs of students at the secondary level are very different as well. So why would we approach with a one size fits all approach? So then at the secondary level, the split of the week where you would have a hybrid where students would be in 2 days. And if we think about a cohort of students, again, half the population, that they would be in 2 days a week. The other cohort would be in and the other 2 days a week. And then we would have a full remote day on the other day. So as an example, the plan that we've been discussing is for middle school and high school, for students to be in cohort A, cohort B, and cohort C. Cohort A would be on a Monday, then cohort B would come in on a Tuesday. It would be a remote learning for all on Wednesday, and then A and B on Thursday and Friday. Siblings from the middle school and high school would be in the same cohorts. Cohort C would be our students that are most at risk when we think about our specialized populations, meaning in specialized programs, our English learners. They would be in full time all week. That model itself, when we think from a curriculum instruction standpoint, it keeps students in the face of teachers more regularly. You wouldn't have students that would be out for 5 days in a row if we had an A-B model. So that would allow our teachers to see where any learning gaps are there more quickly with students as they're working. The students that are in person on one day, those say cohort A, the cohort B students would be remote learning. And that the exact schedule, there would be a set schedule, there would be attendance taking. And as far as synchronous, where it's live instruction versus asynchronous, those details, that's still a lot within our planning to be able to find opportunities for students to be able to engage in ways if they're not physically in the building. For our elementary students, to be developmentally appropriate, we're looking at an AM/PM model. So that way we have all of our students in every single day of the week. In the morning, they would have their core content instruction when we think about literacy and math. The afternoon session would be the remote piece when we think about our special areas with music, world language, art, wellness. By having an AM and a PM session, we also then are able to keep with consistency of structure of schedules for our students. And then we'll able to have our cohort C students, those that are qualified for special education in our specialized programs and our English learners, again, they would be in full time.
I just want to make it clear, because I'm not sure it was, that the AM/PM is a 50% in the AM, 50% in the PM. So if they're in the AM program and receiving the special services during the PM time, the children that were in the PM time are receiving those special services in the AM time. So again, it's 50%, 50%, and it's in both of them have a remote component for the non-core courses.
Could I just jump in really quickly here, because we're getting several questions about special education and what that might look like. So I don't know if Dr. Burdos, if you want to start, and then maybe Mr. Michaelasic could fill in a little bit about that as well.
I'll first start off by saying it's going to look very different than it did in the spring. When we talk about remote learning, it's going to look different. So with special education. So I'll turn it over. I'm just thinking about the time and the questions and what we still have to go through. So let me turn that over, Mr. Michaelasic.
Thank you, Dr. Burdos. So this has been one interesting year to switch districts for sure. So as Dr. Burdos mentioned, the state came out with the initial reopening of schools plan. Shortly thereafter, the state came out with guidance for special education purposes. It was on July 9th. And so what it essentially does is it advises districts, whether remote, hybrid, or fully in person, all services on a student's IEP are required to be given. And so it's our job to ensure that we're creative and flexible in how we provide those services. And kind of speaking to the technology piece a little bit, it's my department working hand in hand with the technology department. So if we do go a hybrid model, and what does our remote instruction look like as far as the special education end? And that comes into forms of professional development and training with teletherapy. And that's a form of therapy, whether it be speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, any related services that students would get remotely. And so I was kind of going through a couple of questions in the Q&A here. So I just wanted to answer one of them. Whatever services are in the student's IEP, they will be given those services, but we need to remember that the synchronous instruction will happen and teachers will need to be trained in those areas in order to give that teletherapy. So it's my job as the district special education director to ensure that our teachers are trained to provide those virtual services for students synchronously. One of the biggest components that I don't want to underestimate is, and we can all agree to this, that our students with disabilities are by far the most affected by this closure. And so therefore, looking at the state's guidance, one of the big pieces that we're going to do is every parent will receive a meeting and a phone call to review what special education services will look like in the beginning of the year, whether it be a team meeting, whether it be parent contacts. But what we're going to do is ensure that whatever services we deliver via the student's IEP, they'll be given and collaborated with families, because not only do we have to meet the families and students' needs, but we also need to meet the families' needs in their own working lives and personal lives. And so trying to balance FAPE while providing IEP services with the given health and safety regulations is no easy feat. But I will say that as far as the teletherapy services, those will be happening if the hybrid model is adopted in a synchronous approach. Is there anything else?
Thank you. Well, the other one that may relate, not for you, Mr. Michael-Lazek, but maybe for Mr. Yukna or Dr. Berdos, is really related to extended day, because there will be big implications for extended day, and people are wondering if those services for before and after care will be available.
Well, I can start, and then Mr. Yukna can continue. So extended day is part of one of our subcommittees, and so we know how many students that we have before school and after school. And then at the same time, when we think about weeks like February vacation, April vacation, we have the opportunity to have students full-time. We're looking for additional space that could provide, for instance, in the elementary, if a student was in the extended day program and they're in the morning session, that they could then have the opportunity for something such as the extended day in the afternoon, and then would have extended day beyond that. So that's really in development. It depends on space. But at the same time, it's something that we're very much pursuing. And then at the same time, having conversations with the Y to see if there's anything that we can do there in partnership. But extended day itself would still take place before school and after school. We're looking at some additional opportunities, knowing that in a half-day model, or any model, quite honestly, if you're in a hybrid situation, it is on parents and families from a childcare perspective. We understand very much the challenges that are there. We have many of our own staff members that are here that are parents in Foxborough. I mean, their voices, when we think about all of the information that we're gathering and how to handle any of these kinds of challenges, those voices at the table, whether there are staff members who are parents and thinking about childcare, that is something that is very much at the forefront of our planning too. And what are some opportunities that we could possibly provide? So Mr. Yukna, I don't know if you have anything else to add or clarify anything that I've mentioned.
No, I think the biggest point, quite honestly, is the added space that we're looking to see if it's available, because obviously inside our buildings during the day, in potentially that AM PM model, all the rooms are being used based on the social distancing of the 6 feet. So we don't have additional space that we could run an extended day, and even the extended day has to operate under the same guidance. So they're not allowed to, have kids 2 feet apart, in a normal process either. So if we're adopting a 6-foot model, we're adopting a 6-foot model throughout our programs. And so the critical component, as Dr. Bernos noted, is seeing what we can come up with, either with collaboration with the Y or with another facility in town that we can use for the space.
And the other thing that I would just like to add, as far as the hybrid model here, as we talk a little bit about elementary, going back to facilities. So in order to be able to run a hybrid model that is an AM session and PM, and if we think back to years ago, that was kindergarten. That's how kindergarten ran, even in as much as 5-6 years ago here. Because we have our own buses, we own our own buses and employ our own bus drivers, that requires a double run during the day. We have worked with routes and continue to work with bus routes to be able to see if we can do that, feeling that it is critical to be able to see our students every day. And again, at that point, you would be able to have them socially distanced at the 6 feet. The cleaning that would take place between those 2 sessions, that goes back to what I had mentioned earlier when we think about our custodial staff, because they would then be all hands on deck at the elementary when we think about the evening custodians. So they're there to clean between the cohort A that was the morning, the cohort B that's in the afternoon. Teachers are not cleaning. They're going to be their lunch and their prep time and collaboration for planning. Students that have free and reduced lunch, we would be providing lunch in kind of a grab and go, so they would be able to have the meals to go with them too. But that would eliminate the cafeteria distancing challenges because there would not be lunch served in that particular model.
Can I just jump in with a couple of clarifications? A lot of questions in the chat about how that will be managed in terms of time in between the AM and PM sessions, because it seems like it would take a long time to clean the room. So as Mr. Yuka mentioned, with the electrostatic misters, it takes about 5 minutes to mist an entire classroom. That mist lands on every surface that's exposed. They've been using it in our offices every evening since this started. It takes a few minutes to dry after that, so it would give the custodians plenty of time between the AM and PM sessions to sanitize all the classrooms. In between, the regular touch points will be constantly cleaned throughout the day. And there was one other one. Sorry, I'll come back to it because I got to find it.
So I would just mention in relation to cohorting of students. So at the elementary level, you're able to cohort students by classroom. They stay in the same classroom. Our specialists would be on carts where they would not be coming if we were in that particular model because that would be remote. At the middle school level for 5th and 6th grade, we're able to cohort students to keep them in the same classrooms and they're within their houses at the middle school. Grades 7 and 8, there would be some movement when we think about cohorting of students because they do move classes somewhat. We would be able to reduce some of that movement. But working with the Board of Health, when we think about the movement, it's thinking about hallways and having particular pathways for students and marking and training of students, if you will, of where to walk. We also know that from the passing and wearing masks, that the concern, and from what the Board of Health has advised, that they're walking in a hallway. They're not congregating in a place, but you still have the cleaning that takes place. So if we have surfaces like the desk, it's assigned seats for the same student, but it would be the cleaning of the desk and they would have their individual items. We wouldn't have sharing of items. At the high school level, cohorting of students, the high school, quite honestly, you're not able to cohort students. You have mixtures of grades from classes across the building. So we would be restricting movement to sides of the hallway. So that's just an example. I know that we're thinking about elementary here, but I think it's important to talk about the cohorting just so you have an idea that at the elementary level, we are able to cohort, but when you think about something like the high school, we're not.
I just want to jump in with some additional questions. So there seems to be some confusion with the AM PM. So the students would be broken into 2 separate cohorts. There was a question if we would be doing that by the alphabet. We're still working on that at this time because we need to make sure our groups are balanced in multiple ways, and obviously the biggest one being size. So we're working on that still. I just want to also say that many of you are putting in the chat a lot of gratitude for the work that's going on. There is a lot of thought and effort going into this, and we would reciprocate our thanks to you for your support and your presence tonight. Your voice is extremely valuable to us, and your concerns really help us to go back and see where we still have more work to do, and that's why we are still not done with our plan. A few people are asking about volunteering. So this chat, as we mentioned before, will be downloaded, and we'll be able to follow up with people who are offering to support us with possible aftercare options and things like that. So thank you for those offers.
And then I'll just move to the third model that we have to plan for, which is the remote learning model, which clearly is not the model
I'm sorry, Dr. Burdos, one other thing, I apologize. People are asking if they have families that have students in multiple grade levels, would they be in the same cohort? The answer is yes. So again, that is partly driving how we cohort our students to make sure that families will try to be at the elementary having their kids. We wouldn't have one in the AM and one in the PM. They would be on the same schedule. That's a really important question, so thank you.
So the remote learning model, as we've stated before, we know that it needs to look very different than it did in the spring during that emergency period of time. That would be very structured. It would be where students are online, they're checking in. The exact details of how that all rolls out is part of the plans that are being developed, but you would have synchronous instruction with teachers, with students. You heard a lot back in the spring, some of our frustrations with trying to implement WebEx to be able to safe, secure environment for students to be able to collaborate. We now have a district subscription to that, to where students are able to be in that safe environment. And that would be the mode for the collaboration, as well as other tools that we have. And we've been using that this summer, and there would be training for students and for parents, and that will be a game changer, to be quite honest. So you'll see multiple tiles on a screen at a time. And we know that that really made a difference when we were using Microsoft Teams by only being able to see there at the end 9 tiles at a time. So clearly a remote learning model. I mean, as far as the pros, sure, it's the safest model from a medical and scientific perspective. And that's really important. The laptops would be the game changer there for every student. But we also know that it socially isolates our students, and the social emotional well-being is something that we know that is critical to being able to meet their needs. So it's not just the academic piece, it's having them in a routine and to be able to be in school. So the more that we can provide that structure in a remote plan will be critical to making the best that we can if students are at home. We also know that for families, one of the things that was extremely difficult was those of you that are trying to work from home, being able to work with your youngest learners and to provide what they need, particularly when you think about K1 and 2. It's just an enormous challenge for parents and what it's done with families. And we recognize that. I mean, many of us have our own children, and the challenges and the complexities of that, it just cannot be understated. But if we are in a remote environment, it will look very different. There will be synchronous instruction. There will be attendance taken. There will be grades. So know that it will not be a duplication of the spring. There's going to be much higher expectations.
I also want to add, I think one of the things we've discussed as in all of our subcommittees is the hope that we can get children back in school in some format, basically to make that remote learning more successful. Obviously, if we have any time together with the students, with the new laptops, with the software that we're going to be using, and we can face-to-face instruct how it's supposed to be done and how it is done, we can make much faster advancements than if we have to start off with everybody getting something in their hands remotely and being able to learn it all, from that standpoint. So we know that's kind of a critical thing, and it, obviously, if it works, it's the best mode we can. So either the in-person full or the hybrid gives us at least that ability to get the professional development with the students and the teachers done, so that if we do, even in those models, get forced out, at least we've had the opportunity to get everybody prepared.
Dr. Mello, other questions?
Yes. Again, we have several questions about the, hold on, I just want to get back up to that. There are a lot of questions about how we will be testing and what happens if someone is positive and what happens to quarantining. And I can say that there are a lot of that is being dictated by the state, and there are a lot of protocols, but I will let Dr. Burdos pick that piece up.
So yes, there's a lot of training and many different protocols that we're going to follow. The state put out, they've continued over the summer to trickle out guidance in so many different areas, whether it's transportation or in health safety and these scenarios. And it's very extensive as far as the protocols that we follow, that teachers would be trained in, that students, that that we would communicate with parents. So as an example, if you had someone in a classroom that had been exposed and they were tested positive, we know exactly what steps we have to follow. The importance of cohorting is that you don't have students mingling with other students from other classrooms. So that way you don't have an impact on another class. Could we find that a particular classroom, if there was an exposure and had to be quarantined, then students and the teacher would be out for 2 weeks as an example, but that doesn't mean the whole school would be or the whole district would be. There's so many different scenarios that play out with that, and that we follow very strict guidelines. For training, as an example, it's going to be so important as part of the safety measures that parents keep students home. I know as being a mother of 4, there's been times when your child you think, oh, they're not really feeling that well, we're going to see how it goes. It's going to be more important than ever that if your child is sick or you think that they are based on symptoms that you're seeing, is for them to stay home. If we're going to have training, even for bus drivers, if students are boarding a bus and that they notice that there's particular symptoms that are there, then we have protocols that we have to follow. We have to have separate waiting rooms next to the nurses station so that students can be in a separate location, supervised of course, but again, so that the contact's not there. The cohorting allows for contact tracing, and it's critical for us to be able to know which students have come in contact with each other. So that's why even when we think about things like recess, there are protocols and guidelines that we have to follow, because then if there are any suspicions of symptoms, that we follow all of those very specific guidelines.
Thank you, Dr. Bertos. A couple questions about if this chat is being recorded. I believe so because it's on Foxborough Cable, but I don't know for sure. You do believe it is, Dr. Bertos? Okay. And a lot of questions given the announcement by the commissioner that they have given a 10-day pause to the beginning of the school year if we have decided on the first day of school, which we do not have a clear first day of school yet. Correct, Dr. Bertos?
Correct. So I will say that we just learned about that obviously this week, and that the calendar itself is a function of the school committee, and that is a discussion that will have to go before the school committee. We had a call with the commissioner today that those 10 days would be at the beginning of the year, and it is for planning for whatever scenario we find ourselves in. So even as an example, at next week's school committee meeting, when these discussions and presentation takes place and a vote for the model for us to enter school, it's important to remember that that could change by the time school begins as well. So to answer the question of the exact start date, could that change and not be September 1st for students? Yes, based on that, but I can't give you the exact date because that's going to be a topic of discussion at school committee.
If people are wondering about the option of fully remote learning.
So fully remote learning would be through a learning management system that the Department of Education has, they are in the process of purchasing. It would require us to pay a per student fee for them to be in that remote learning LMS, learning management system. So it is independent of Foxborough teachers if they're in that if they choose that particular program. And we do not have all of the details. The Department of Ed has said today that they're down to 2 and that more information is coming. But that would be something that we would have to have as a separate, if even if we're in remote learning, if we've started but someone has chosen due to medical reasons that they're not able to come to school, they would have a remote learning platform that's different, because we can't have teachers that are teaching students in school or hybrid and then completely teaching a whole separate program. And the details on that, we're still waiting. And we've been waiting very anxiously for that, because it's a platform that has all of the content that's there that would be aligned with the Massachusetts standards. But again, it would be an independent program, if you will.
Some really great questions are coming up about now that parents have a little more information, will we be surveying them again? Yes, we will be continuing to seek your input as we continue down this process and making our decisions. So I understand that your answers may be changing as you're hearing some details about our plans or transportation. If they're in the AM/PM model for elementary, transportation will be provided. With half of the students coming in at a time, we would be more able to achieve the restrictions for the bus. So that would definitely, if you had said you didn't want transportation, but now because you have a half day, you would need it, we would be able to accommodate that. But there will be additional surveys coming. Are you waiting for me to do more questions, Dr. Bertos? Okay, let me just see, because some of these we've answered. Just for the record, there's 150 questions in here. So I'm trying to find the ones that are repeated the most often. Let's see. Thank you for all the people who are volunteering. That is very exciting. Appreciate that. And people are wondering about, would there be, I think we touched on this already, but I think it's a concern about, and I think you talked about partnering with local community community partners, having that extended day option. That is something we're still working on for the people who are working or single parents. Will there be a people asked about the day of school. Will the hours remain the same? That's an excellent question. Yes, the hours will remain the same. And there will be a 75-minute break between the AM and the PM sessions so that there will be a staggered entry for students coming in. I think that's what that question pertains to. Let me see what else I can find here. Actually, earlier in the chat, there were several questions about kindergarten and students transitioning to kindergarten. If we want to talk a little bit about that, Dr. Bertos.
I'm not sure exactly what the question is as far as transitioning. And we're talking about things like kindergarten screening and coming in for a kindergarten on its own.
Specific question. What considerations are being weighed for incoming kindergartners as this is their first experience in public school? How are you addressing the transition for those entering the school system for their emotional health and safety?
I think that I will turn that over to one of the elementary principals because the three of them have been working so much this summer on exactly that, as well as thinking some creative ideas for kindergartners to transition to since it is their first experience with school.
Yeah, and I think, Michelle and Kate, please hop in. Along with your children's physical well-being is their social emotional, and that has been a primary focus of ours. For kindergarten, we realize that for students and families, many of you have not even set foot in our schools. So we have obviously the traditional events such as our open house and screening, we can't conduct in the same way. So we are in the process of exploring different opportunities to have you come in, to have your children meet with their teachers. A big difference this time around is in March, we already had our learning communities. Your children were part of their classroom family. They had connections to their teachers. We realized across every grade, that's not the case this time. So we are prioritizing the social emotional part, the connections, but specifically for kindergarten, we are looking at opportunities where we can have families come in, but once again, under the right conditions and making sure it could be outside, meeting with the teachers and getting a chance to see the teacher's face without a mask on. So we realize the importance of that. We're also working with our school counselors and all of our classroom teachers as well to really hear the thoughts that they have, because it is going to look different. On the screening part, we're mandated by law to have that conducted, but what's best for students and their connections to the school right off is to start with the social emotional and get connected to the classrooms and their familiarity and feeling safe. So right now we are exploring possibly having that being done during the school day and having other educators within the school building, such as reading specialists, math specialists, other staff members assist with the screening. So that way we're not taking away some of the learning time. And I think for Kate and Michelle, if there's any other thoughts that you might have as well.
I think some other things that we're exploring are, somebody had asked about, going beyond because they won't have recess, building that community as an entire class. And So as we get further down the road and really looking at what that 2.5 hours looks like, we're considering ways where there's maybe a morning meeting and a closing meeting that all the students can participate in. If they are assigned to AM, then the PM kids would be brought in remotely and vice versa. So again, we're creating that community with the hope of eventually being able to be all together. But regardless, in the beginning, though, the face-to-face time that they have with their teachers is really important for them to have all their safety and social emotional needs met first.
I just want to, we're getting a little over our time and we do have another meeting starting, but I just want to touch on the question that's related to kindergarten and mask wearing. It is not required in KN1 according to the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. However, it will be strongly recommended. With that, if we are in a hybrid model, we will be going for optimal 6 feet spacing because we will have the room in the classroom. So that was a question in the chat that I just wanted to touch upon. So Dr. Bertos, do you want me to do any other questions or do we need to wrap it up? What is your thought?
If you have any other questions that you see that are the same, then maybe we can answer here, but we do need to think about the time and know that we're not going to be able to answer, like we said at the beginning, all of the questions this evening.
Well, there were questions that are a little bit more technical about if a student becomes sick, is there a special space that they can go to? I think that's something we can quickly answer.
Yes, that's what I was referring to earlier when we're talking about the waiting room next to the nurse's office.
Okay, so at this time, I've been trying to answer some questions that I can privately in the chat. As I said, the questions that we have here, along with the answers, anything that's been answered that has been included in the chat, we can share that with you. And then the rest of the questions we will be downloading and again, putting them together, seeing where the commonality lies, seeing what we're able to answer, because there are things we still don't know the answer to. There's some very technical questions here about certain things that I know we don't know the answer to yet. But then things that we can include in our school committee presentation. One question that has come up a couple of times is will we be sharing even an overview of our plan prior to Monday? Excuse me, not Monday, and prior to the Wednesday school committee meeting.
No, the plan will be shared at the school committee meeting. And then I know that we also have to reset this before the next meeting starts. So unfortunately, we do need to close this meeting at this time. But I would just really like to say, out of the 249 of you that are viewing, thank you very much for coming to this very new format for us here. And I'd like to thank all of the administrators that are here as well and answering questions. And just to end with, we are at a time and experiencing a time that we've never experienced. And when we think about education, it's not something that we could have ever planned for. So there's many, many layers. And the more you go into the layers, the more layers that appear. So what I would like to leave you with is to know that we are working and making decisions that are in the best interest of students. And again, as said at the beginning, we know that this is an incredibly difficult time for all. Health and safety of our students is our top priority. So thank you again for joining us this evening. And I wish you all a very good night.
Thank you, everybody.